We are going to be looking at and discussing two very interesting chronographs offered by rival companies, the Longines BigEye and the Breitling 765. What makes this discussion so interesting is that these two pieces look almost identical, and that should come as no surprise, since in the 50s, when these pieces were developed, they used the same dial manufacturers for the most part. Most companies were chopping and changing. There was no real uniformity shared between brands. Also note that these pieces were created for air forces, and they had certain codes of conduct to follow, certain ways that dials needed to be arranged, and so forth. It's amazing seeing the number of reissues from various brands. The one that comes to mind is the Air Command from Bulang. Then seeing how Breitling has managed to pull out the stops to create these amazing reissues. And in a similar way, Longines is doing some incredible work as well. These two companies seem to be vying for the top spot with regards to these vintage reissue pieces. And I don't think many of us are complaining. What can we note when we look at these two watches? I would say that one of them has managed to stand the test of time longer, and that will be explained at the end of the video. The first thing that really draws you in, the numeral placement on the dials. Very similar. We notice that the typeface is different though. Where we see the Breitling has a much more rigid use of the numerals, the Longines seems to stretch out and fatten the numerals in places. Notice the 7 having a hook on the end, where on the Breitling it's straight. Now if we are to compare the numeral placement between the two, I would say that the Breitling has a better sense of uniformity with its use of numerals, where Longines seems to be a bit more all over the place, and that in part is due to the subdial interference at the 2 and the 4. We notice that they lose some of their space. Then we look at legibility, a very important aspect for any pilot watch, and we see that they share a very similar nature, high contrast. You notice that white is used very often against a black dial. It's very appropriate and actually very forward-thinking. When you're using these things as instruments, you need to read them quickly. They need to be as legible as possible. And this contrast and use of line weight is probably best expressed when we look at the Longines BigEye. We see just how the plots have been arranged. How when we look at the plots surrounding the numerals on the dial, they stand out. The minute track also follows suit. Each subdial has a different use of line weights. That could be quite jarring for the uninitiated. It seems like quite an overload of detail when you look at the dial at first. Compared to the Breitling, it seems a lot simpler. Breitling seems to have taken a much more toned down approach with this model, lessening the use of the highlights around the subdials, keeping them all the same size. You notice the minute track doesn't seem to have much of a detailed layout. We have 5-minute numerals set around the main numerals on the dial. It looks fairly basic. The one element that seems to really define this watch is the use of luminova at the 3 o'clock position on the subdial. Now this is a chronograph minute counter, and the use of luminova, not only on the minute counter but on the chronograph hand, very eloquently appointed. It means that you would be able to read the chronograph as it runs in the dark, which is something we seldom see on most pieces. The Longines BigEye doesn't highlight any of those details, so you couldn't read the chronograph in the dark. But both of these models adopt very luminescent hands, and of course the numerals around the dial makes time telling very easy. If we now return back to the Breitling, we see that it has a rotating bezel. And this immediately calls to the Breguet Type 20. We might even find that this case design was used directly by the two brands at the time. But it is an added feature that would make the watch even more useful, being able to have the ability to time 2 separate intervals at once. When we look at these two pieces, the Breitling seems a lot safer in many ways compared to the Longines. The BigEye seems a lot bolder in the way it approaches its design. Take elements from a Flieger watch a lot more, allocating better space to the subdials and the numerals, where the Breitling seems to focus more on keeping the dial simple. There is one aspect that I think the Breitling lacks, and that is luminova at the 3, 6 and 9 position. Having plots, whether round or square, as you're now seeing in this render, would make the watch look more complete. The Longines model, on the other hand, seems to address this quite well with the use of heavy line weight at every numeral point around the minute track. As for which watch seems to look like it's aged better, The Longines seems to have that formula nailed down quite tightly. That is purely because the aesthetic of the watch seems more modern. We look at the use of pencil hands in contrast to syringe hands. We look at the use of font and typefaces, the emphasis of line weights, the allocation of space around the dial. The Breitling still looks like it belongs in the late 40s, not so much the early 50s. You would imagine a telemeter scale on this piece, where the Longines seems to have been able to transcend that time a lot easier. With a great choice of contrasting handsets used on the subdials, appropriate for their base function, whether that is counting the running seconds, whether that is for the chronograph function. It is just incredible to see how these two brands from completely different families manage to use similar inspiration, but ultimately result in completely different watches. If we are going to look into movements, we know that the Longines uses a ETA-inspired chronograph movement, where the Breitling uses a hand-wound, in-house made caliber. When we talk about value for money, the BigEye is much more accessible, where this Breitling piece is probably going to be more of a niche watch. But they really do make for a great pair. They both show off that 50s era inspiration, the modern age of aviation, and I will reiterate, are probably two of the best brands in the industry that are creating these reissues. Bravo.